He said it on a Thursday in July, and he said it in front of witnesses, and he said it in the way of a man who believed what he was saying so completely that the saying of it felt like a kindness rather than a cruelty. He was wrong about the kindness. He was also wrong about the belonging. But those were discoveries that required time, and in July he did not have the time yet, and the woman standing in the entrance hall of Ashmore Hall with a basket of fresh herbs and a face that did not change when he said it did not give him the time either, because she turned and she walked out of the hall and down the steps and back up the lane to the village without looking back, and the door closed behind her, and the hall was quiet, and he stood in the entrance hall and watched the door close, and felt for just a moment that he had done something that could not be undone. He told himself the feeling was wrong. He went back to his study. Her name was Nora Vetch, and she was 22, and she was the daughter of the village herbalist, and she had been bringing fresh herbs to the Ashmore Hall kitchen every Thursday morning for 2 years. Not because she had been hired to bring them, because the cook, whose name was Mrs. Fenn, had mentioned once in the village that the kitchen garden's herb beds had been neglected since the head gardener's retirement, and the herbs she needed for the household were not coming in as they should, and Nora had said, "I have the herbs," and Mrs. Fenn had said, "Can you bring them Thursday?" and Nora had brought them every Thursday since. She was paid in kind. Mrs. Fenn gave her kitchen surplus, and occasionally a portion of what had been prepared, and the arrangement suited both of them, and had suited them for 2 years. The Duke had not been at the hall for most of those 2 years. He had been in London and at the northern property, and twice abroad, and the hall had been run in his absence by Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, and the estate manager, Mr. Calloway, and the Thursday herbs had been part of the kitchen's ordinary routine, noted by no one above stairs, because above stairs did not concern itself with the kitchen's Thursday herbs. He had come back to Ashmore in June. He had come back because the estate required his attention, and because his London life had reached a particular point of saturation that he recognized as the signal to withdraw, and he had withdrawn to Ashmore with the intention of spending the summer managing the estate and the autumn managing the social obligations that the county expected of a man in his position. He was 38. He had been the Duke of Ashmore for 9 years. He had been managing the estate and the title and the county expectations for 9 years, with the efficiency of a man who found efficiency comfortable and found most other things less so. He had been managing a particular set of expectations for the past year that were less comfortable than the estate ones, which were the expectations of his mother and his mother's friends, and his own sense of the appropriate shape of a life, all of which were converging on the conclusion that he should be married by now, and the convergence was producing a pressure he had been managing by being in London and then abroad, and now in Ashmore, where the pressure existed but was at least predictable in its forms. He had arrived in June, and the hall had received him with the organized welcome of a well-run house, and he had settled into the summer with the intention of finding it restoring. He had not found it restoring. He had found it quiet in a way that was not peaceful, but was the quiet of a house that was being maintained rather than lived in, and the distinction was one he had been aware of for 9 years and had not yet known how to address. He had not known about the Thursday herbs. He had found out about them on the 2nd Thursday of July, when he had been coming down the stairs at an hour earlier than his usual habit, and had encountered a young woman in the entrance hall with a basket. She had looked up when she heard him on the stairs. He had looked at her. She was not dressed as a servant. She was dressed as the village girl she was, in the practical working clothes of someone who had been in a kitchen garden in the morning and was now inside with the evidence of it on her hands, and she was standing in the entrance hall of Ashmore Hall with the ease of a person who had been coming here every Thursday for 2 years and had never had reason to think of it as unusual. He had not found this ease appropriate. He had said, "Who are you, and what are you doing in this house?" She had said, "I bring the herbs for Mrs. Fenn on Thursdays." He had said, "Through the kitchen entrance?" She had said, "Mrs. Fenn asked me to bring them through the front when it rained, so the basket did not get wet." She said, "It is raining." He had looked at the door. It was raining. He had looked back at her. He had said, "This is not a public entrance." She had said, "I know." She had said it without apology and without aggression, just the acknowledgement of a fact. Something about the ease of her, the absence of the deference he expected, the way she stood in the entrance hall as though the entrance hall were a place she had a right to be, had produced in him a response he was not proud of later. He had said, "You'll never belong in this house." He had said it as a statement of fact, the way he stated facts, clearly and without softening, and it had landed in the hall the way facts landed when they were said to people who had not been expecting them, which was with a weight that was not the weight of a fact, but the weight of a verdict. Her face had not changed. That was the thing he remembered afterward. Her face had not changed, and her posture had not changed, and she had looked at him for one long moment, with eyes that were the color of winter rain, and that saw him with a completeness that he had not been prepared for, and then she had turned and walked to the door, and down the steps, and up the lane, and the door had closed. He had stood in the entrance hall. He had gone back to his study. He had told himself the feeling was wrong. He had been telling himself that for 4 days, when Mrs. Fenn came to the study. Mrs. Fenn was 60 and had been the Ashmore cook for 30 years, and had cooked for his father before him, and had the particular authority of a person who had been in a house longer than the current inhabitants and knew it better. And she came to the study with the expression of a woman who had decided to say something and was going to say it. She said, "Your Grace?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Nora Vetch has not come this Thursday." He said, "I am aware." She said, "She came every Thursday for 2 years." She said, "She has not sent word, and she has not come, and I do not have the herbs I need for the week." He said, "I will speak to the kitchen gardener." Mrs. Fenn said, "The kitchen gardener does not know what I need." She said, "Nora Vetch knew what I needed because she grew it, and she paid attention to what was in season and what was coming, and she brought what was useful before I knew I needed it." He said, "I will hire someone." Mrs. Fenn said, "Your Grace." She said it the way she had been saying it for 9 years, with the patience of a woman who had been saying "Your Grace" to a man she had known since he was 6 years old, and who knew the difference between what he said and what he meant. She said, "You told that girl she would never belong in this house." He said, "I told her the herb delivery should come through the kitchen entrance." Mrs. Fenn said, "You told her she would never belong." He said nothing. Mrs. Fenn said, "She has been coming to this house every week for 2 years, and she knew the name of every person in this kitchen, and she brought the right herb for what was needed without being asked, and she belongs in this house more thoroughly than most people who were born to it." She left. He sat in the study. He thought about the entrance hall and the basket, and the winter rain eyes and the face that had not changed. He thought about belonging. He thought about the house that was maintained rather than lived in, and the quiet that was not peaceful, and he thought that Mrs. Fenn had said a true thing, and he had said a wrong thing, and the wrong thing had driven away the herbs for a week, and possibly longer, and the herbs were a minor practical matter, but the wrong thing was not a minor matter. He went to the village on Saturday. He went himself, which he did not usually do for village matters, and he drove himself, and the village received him with the particular attention that a village gave to the Duke driving through it on a Saturday morning in July. He found the herbalist's house. It was at the edge of the village in the way of houses that kept a kitchen garden, which was close enough to the lane for commerce and far enough from the centre to have the space for it, and the garden was visible from the lane, a substantial and well-ordered garden that told him, from the lane, that the person who managed it knew what they were doing. He knocked at the door. An older woman answered, who had the look of Nora about the eyes, winter rain, and the same quality of seeing. He said, "I am looking for Nora Vetch." The woman said, "I know who you are." She said it without hostility and without welcome, just the plain statement of the village woman who had been watching the Duke drive through the lane for 9 years and knew exactly what she was looking at. She said, "Nora is in the garden." He went to the garden. Nora was at the far end, doing something to the bean poles that required her full attention, and produced in her the same ease of posture he had seen in the entrance hall, the ease of a person doing work they knew completely in a place they understood. She heard him and looked up. The same face, the same eyes. He said, "Miss Vetch." She waited. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said nothing. He said, "What I said in the entrance hall was wrong." He said, "I said it as though it were a fact, and it was not a fact. It was a rudeness, and I am sorry for it." She looked at him with the winter rain eyes, and she said, "You believed it." He said, "Yes." He said, "I believed it in the moment, and the believing does not excuse the saying." She said, "You believed that a person who had been coming to your house every week for 2 years and knew every person in your kitchen did not belong there." He said, "I believed it without thinking about it, which is a different thing from believing it after thought, and I am telling you that after thought I was wrong." She said, "What changed?" He said, "Mrs. Fenn came to the study on Monday. Something moved in her eyes, not quite a smile." She said, "Mrs. Fenn." He said, "Yes." She said, "What did she say?" He said, "She said, you know the name of every person in the kitchen, and you brought the right herb for what was needed before she knew she needed it." He said, "She said, you belong in the house more thoroughly than most people who were born to it." Nora said, "Mrs. Fenn is generous." He said, "Mrs. Fenn is accurate." She looked at him. She said, "The herbs are ready." He said, "Yes." She said, "I was going to send them with Tom from the village, not bring them myself." He said, "I know." He said, "I would like you to bring them yourself." He said, "I would like you to come back on Thursday." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the kitchen needs the herbs, and Mrs. Fenn needs the person who knows what she needs, and because I said a wrong thing to you in my entrance hall, and I would like to correct it." She said, "Bringing me back to the hall corrects it." He said, "Yes." She looked at the bean poles, and then she looked at him, and she said, "I will come on Thursday." He said, "Yes." He said, "Through the kitchen entrance." She said, "When it is not raining." He said, "When it is not raining." Something happened in the region of her expression that was not quite a smile and was not quite anything else, but was entirely its own thing, and he drove back to the hall, and he thought about it on the way, and he did not have a name for what it was, but he knew he wanted to see it again. She came on Thursday. She came through the kitchen entrance because it was not raining, and she brought the herbs, and Mrs. Fenn received her with the warmth of a woman receiving a person she had been waiting for. He heard this from the study, not the words but the quality of it, the warmth of the kitchen in the morning, and he went down to the kitchen. He told himself he went down for another reason. The kitchen at 10 in the morning was not a place the Duke of Ashmore went without a reason, and his reason was thin, but he went. Nora was laying out the herbs on the kitchen table, and Mrs. Fenn was at the range, and the kitchen maid was at the sink, and the kitchen was doing what it did best, which was being full and warm and purposeful. He came in. Nora looked up. He said, "I came to see if the kitchen needed anything." Mrs. Fenn said, "The kitchen needs marjoram for Thursday next, and the marjoram is behind on the west bed." Nora said, "I know." She said, "I will bring extra from the north bed." She said, "The north bed marjoram is later, but it is fuller." Mrs. Fenn said, "The north bed marjoram has a different flavor." Nora said, "Slightly sweeter." She said, "For the Thursday use, it is better." Mrs. Fenn said, "Yes." She said, "Bring from the north bed." He stood at the edge of this exchange and watched a conversation between two people who understood each other completely, and he thought about the house that was maintained rather than lived in, and he thought that the kitchen was lived in, and the living was the kitchen, and the herbs, and the north bed marjoram, and the woman who brought them, and the cook who knew which bed they should come from. He said, "The kitchen is well managed, Mrs. Fenn." She said, "It is, Your Grace." He looked at Nora. She was already looking at him with the winter rain eyes. He said, "May I see the herb list?" He said it to both of them, not to either specifically. Mrs. Fenn produced the list. He looked at the list, and he said to Nora, "Do you have all of these?" She looked at the list and said, "Yes, except the saffron." She said, "The saffron is not grown locally." She said, "Mrs. Fenn orders it from the town." He said, "And the rest?" She said, "The rest I have, or can have within a week, except the tarragon in September, which is early this year." She said, "If the kitchen uses less tarragon in late August, the September supply will last through October." He said, "Can the kitchen use less tarragon in late August?" Mrs. Fenn said, "I can adjust the menu." He said, "Good." He folded the list and gave it back to Mrs. Fenn, and he looked at Nora again. She said, "I should finish laying out." He said, "Yes." He went back upstairs. He sat in the study, and he thought that he had gone to the kitchen to see the winter rain eyes and had spent 10 minutes talking about tarragon and marjoram, and had found this 10 minutes more interesting than any 10 minutes he had spent at a county dinner in the past year. He thought about that for a while. The Thursdays became the part of the week he was aware of. Not because anything happened at them, not in the beginning. Nothing happened except the kitchen and the herbs and the occasional exchange at the kitchen table that he sometimes walked past and sometimes stopped at. And the stopping was natural enough that it did not require explanation. The Duke walking through his own kitchen in the morning, and the exchanges were the exchanges of a person who had grown up learning the practical management of a garden, and a person who was learning to pay attention to the practical management of things. He learned, over those weeks, about the herb garden and the rotation and the relationships between what was planted where and why. He learned about the soil in the north bed and the south bed and why they produced differently. He learned, because she mentioned it once in passing, that she had been running the herbalist's practice since she was 19, when her mother's health had made it necessary, and that the practice served not just the whole kitchen, but most of the village households, and 3 farms, and the doctor's surgery, and that she had developed a written record of every plant and its use and season that was now the comprehensive document of the Ashmore area's medicinal and culinary herbs. He said, "You wrote this down." She said, "I started writing it down when I was 17 because my mother had it in her head, and heads were not reliable enough for the kind of knowledge that needed to be available in the middle of the night when someone was sick." He said, "You wrote it so someone else could use it." She said, "I wrote it so the knowledge would exist outside one person." She said, "Knowledge that lives in one head dies with that head." He said, "Where is it?" She said, "At the house." She said, "There are 3 copies," she said, "one at the house, one at the doctor's surgery, and one at the church, because the church is the most permanent building in the village, and if the house burns down, the church copy survives." He said, "You made 3 copies." She said, "Yes." He said, "By hand?" She said, "Yes." She said, "It took 2 winters." He looked at her. She said, "The plants did not wait for me to have the copies made, so the plants were the priority, and the copying was the winter work." He said, "Yes." He said, "Miss Vetch." She waited. He said, "I have 9 years of estate records that exist in one copy in the estate archive and have never been reviewed for gaps or errors." She said nothing. He said, "I am not asking you to copy them." He said, "I am telling you because you have done the thing I have been meaning to do for 9 years and have not done, and I find that clarifying." She said, "The estate records are considerably more complex than an herb guide." He said, "Yes." He said, "And considerably more important, which is why the single copy is a problem and why I have not known how to address it." She said, "What format are they in?" He said, "Ledgers." He said, 40 years of quarterly ledgers in the archive room." She said, "Have they been catalogued?" He said, "No." She said, "The first step is cataloguing." She said, "You cannot make useful copies of what you cannot find." She said, "A catalogue is the map of the record, and without the map, the record is just paper." He said, "Yes." He said, "You sound like Mr. Calloway." She said, "I have talked to Mr. Calloway about the estate records." She said, "I asked him once about the historical herb purchases because I wanted to understand what the hall had used in previous years, and he told me the records were uncatalogued." He said, "You asked Calloway about historical herb purchases." She said, "Yes." She said, "The historical record tells you what was successful and what was not, and saves you repeating the failures." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is also true of the estate records." She said, "Yes." She said, "Everything is true of the estate records." She said, "The estate records are just the herb guide for the land." He stood at the kitchen table and thought about the estate records as the herb guide for the land, and he thought that this was the most useful description of the estate records he had ever heard, and he had heard several hundred descriptions of them over 9 years from solicitors and estate managers and accountants, and none of them had said anything as clear as this. He said, "Would you be willing to help with the catalogue?" She said, "I am an herbalist." He said, "Yes." He said, "And you have spent 2 winters making 3 copies of your knowledge base in a format that survives a fire, and you asked Calloway the right question about the historical records, and you described the estate records as the herb guide for the land, which is the most useful description of them I have heard. She said, "The catalogue is a significant project." He said, "Yes." She said, "The Thursdays are already full." He said, "Yes." He said, "I am not proposing Thursdays." He said, "I am proposing whatever day is available." She said, "The cataloguing requires access to the archive room." He said, "Yes." She said, "The archive room is above stairs." He said, "Yes." She looked at him with the winter rain eyes. He said, "You belong above stairs, Miss Vetch." He said it plainly and without performance, the plain statement of the plain fact, and it landed differently from the July statement in the entrance hall, which had been a verdict. This was a correction. She said, "Wednesdays." She said, "I can give you a Wednesday afternoon in August." He said, "Wednesday afternoons in August." She said, "Yes." He said, "I will have the archive room unlocked." The first Wednesday, she spent 4 hours in the archive room and came out with a preliminary catalogue of the first decade of ledgers and the list of what was missing and the list of what required cross-referencing to make sense. He had stayed in the study. At 4 o'clock, he came to the archive room. She was at the table with the ledgers around her and the preliminary catalogue in front of her, and the look of a person who had been doing work they were interested in. He said, "How is it?" She said, "The record is better than I expected." She said, "The gaps are mostly in the 1790s, which suggests a period of irregular management, and the ledgers from 1800 on are consistent and well kept." He said, "My grandfather managed the estate from 1795. He said, "The 1790s were his father's period, and his father was more interested in his London house than the estate." She said, "Yes." She said, "The London expenditure in the 1790s is recorded in a separate ledger, and it is comprehensive." She said, "The estate expenditure from the same period is the gap." He said, "My grandfather spent his first years as Duke recovering the estate from his father's neglect." She said, "Yes." She said, "It is visible in the accounts." She said, "There is a period from 1798 to 1808 where the expenditure pattern shows systematic repair." She said, "Every year a different part of the estate." He said, "He made a list." She said, "Yes." She said, "He catalogued the problems in order of urgency and addressed them year by year." She said, "It is a very sensible approach." He said, "It is exactly what you are doing with the herb guide." She looked at the ledger she was holding. She said, "I suppose it is." He said, "The systematic approach." She said, "Yes." She said, "It is the only approach that works for complex problems." She said, "Complex problems addressed all at once produce a mess." She said, "Complex problems addressed in order of urgency, one at a time, produce a result." He said, "Yes." He said, "Your grandfather and my grandfather had the same method." She said, "My grandfather was the village carpenter." She said, "The method was useful for a carpenter, and useful for an estate, and probably useful for most things." He said, "Yes." He said, "Probably." The Wednesdays continued. She came in the afternoon, and she catalogued the archive, and he came at 4, and they talked about what she had found, and the conversations were the conversations of 2 people looking at the same record from different perspectives and discovering that the perspectives were complementary. She saw the pattern in the records. He knew what the records were recording. the specific history of the decisions and the land and the people who had made the decisions. Together, they were reading the estate differently from how either of them could read it alone. He said, "On a Wednesday in September, you are teaching me to read this." She was putting a ledger back on the shelf, and she looked at him over her shoulder and said, "You knew how to read it." He said, "I knew the content." He said, "I did not know how to see the pattern." She said, "The pattern is the story the content tells." He said, "Yes." He said, "And you see stories." She said, "I see what is there." She said, "The story is what is there in order." He sat down at the archive table and looked at the catalogue she had been building for 2 months, and he thought about the story the estate told in order, from his great-grandfather's London excess, to his grandfather's systematic repair, to his father's careful consolidation, to his own 9 years of management. And the story was a clear story, a story of a thing tended and maintained and passed on, and it was his story too, and he had not seen it clearly until she put the ledgers in order. He said, "My grandfather's approach, the systematic repair." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have been managing the estate for 9 years, and I have been addressing problems as they arose, rather than cataloguing them and addressing them in order." She said, "The arising problems require attention." He said, "Yes." He said, "And the systematic ones do not shout for it, and so they wait." She said, "What are the systematic ones?" He said, "The catalogue I have never made." He said, "The archive I have never reviewed." He said, "The belonging question." She looked up. He said, "I told you in July that you would never belong in this house." He said, "I was addressing a problem that did not exist and ignoring the one that did." She said, "The one that did." He said, "The house that is maintained rather than lived in." He said, "The kitchen that is the warmest room in the building because you come to it on Thursdays." He said, "The archive room that has been locked for 9 years and in 2 months of Wednesday afternoons has become the most useful room in the house." She said, "Nicholas." He looked at her. She had not used his name before, not his title, not Your Grace, his name, and she had used it the way she used everything, directly and without apology. He said, "Yes." She said, "The belonging question is not about me." He said, "I know." She said, "You have been living in this house for 9 years, and you are talking about it as though it belongs to someone else." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know." She said, "It belongs to you." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then what is the belonging question?" He said, "The belonging question is whether a house can belong to you when you have been maintaining it rather than living in it." She said, "Can it?" He said, "I do not know." She said, "The herb guide." He said, "Yes." She said, "I maintain the herb guide." She said, "I update it twice a year, and I check the copies, and I replace the pages that have worn." She said, "It belongs to me." She said, "The maintenance is part of the belonging, not the opposite of it." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the days when I am in the garden, and the plants are growing, and I know what they are, and what they do, and they are doing it." She stopped. She said, "That is also belonging." He said, "Yes." She said, "What do you feel in the estate that is like the garden?" He thought about this. He said, "The archive room." She said, "The archive room." He said, "These Wednesday afternoons." He said, "Reading the history of the place and understanding it in a way I had not understood it." She said, That is the belonging. He said, yes. He said, I think so. She said, and before Wednesdays. He said, the Thursdays. She said, yes. He said, the kitchen on Thursday mornings. He said, the tarragon question, and the north bed marjoram, and the herb list. He said, that was the first time the hall felt like a place that was being lived in rather than maintained. She said, I brought that. He said, yes. She said, and you told me I would never belong. He said, yes. He said, I told you that, and I was telling myself that I belonged, and you did not, and I was wrong about both. She was quiet. He said, Nora. She waited. He said, will you stay for dinner? She said, I stay for Wednesdays, not for dinner. He said, I know. He said, I am asking for dinner, which is a different thing from Wednesdays. She said, a different thing. He said, yes. She said, what kind of different? He said, the kind that comes after 2 months of Wednesday afternoons and 4 months of Thursday mornings, and a question about belonging that I have been working up to since July. She said, you have been working up to a dinner. He said, I have been working up to the question that dinner would give me the occasion to ask. She looked at the archive and the catalogue and the ledgers she had been ordering for 2 months, and she looked at him. She said, what is the question? He said, I would like to ask it at dinner, if you will come. She said, that is a very particular way to avoid asking it. He said, yes. He said, I find I need the dinner as a structural support. The almost expression happened on her face. She said, yes. She said, I will stay for dinner. She came to dinner in the dining room in the clothes she had come in, which were not dinner clothes, and she sat at the table with the composure of a person who had decided not to be uncomfortable about not being dressed for dinner, because the decision about whether to be uncomfortable was hers to make. He had asked Mrs. Fenn to do something simple, which Mrs. Fenn had interpreted as doing something excellent in a simple form, which was what Mrs. Fenn always did. They ate. The conversation was easy in the way of conversations between 2 people who had been having conversations for 4 months and had found the shape of them, and they talked about the archive and the catalogue and the 1790s gap and the pattern of his grandfather's repair years, and at the end of the first course he said, you described the estate records as the herb guide for the land. She said, yes. He said, the herb guide is what you made, so the knowledge would survive outside one head. She said, yes. He said, the estate is the same. He said, the estate is the record of everything the land has been, and what has been done with it, and what the doing has produced, and it has been in one head, mine, and before mine my father's, and before his my grandfather's, and one head is not enough. She said, no. He said, you have spent 2 months in the archive, and you know the estate record as well as I do now. He said, not the current management decisions, but the history, the pattern, the story in order. She said, yes. He said, the question I wanted to ask at dinner. She waited. He said, will you share the knowledge base? She said, the knowledge base. He said, yes. He said, will you let the estate knowledge exist in 2 heads rather than 1? He said, will you help me make 3 copies of the understanding, in the way that the herb guide exists in 3 copies, so that if one is lost, the others survive? She said, that is a very careful description of a proposal. He said, yes. He said, I told you I needed the dinner, as a structural support. He said, "I find I need the careful description also." She said, "Nicholas." He said, "Yes." She said, "The belonging question." He said, "Yes." She said, "You told me in July I would never belong in this house." He said, "Yes." She said, "And now you are asking me to be the second copy of the estate knowledge." He said, "Yes." He said, "And the person the house is lived in with, rather than maintained for." She said, "The kitchen on Thursday mornings." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the archive room on Wednesday afternoons." He said, "Yes." She said, "And dinners." He said, "Yes." She said, "Where else?" He said, "Everywhere else, if you want it." She looked at the dining room, the long table that could seat 30 and was set for 2, the candles and the autumn evening outside the windows, and the house that had been quiet for 9 years and was quieter at the far end of the table from her and warmer at this end. She said, "The herb guide has 3 copies." He said, "Yes." She said, "The 3rd copy is at the church." He said, "Yes." She said, "The most permanent building in the village." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is that what you are asking?" He said, "Yes." He said, "That is exactly what I am asking." She said, "The church." He said, "Yes." He said, "In the winter, if you want it in the winter, or in the spring, or whenever." He said, "I am not specifying a season." She said, "By winter." He said, "Yes." He said, "By winter if you want." She was quiet. He waited. She said, "In July you told me I would never belong in this house." He said, "Yes." She said, "In July you were wrong." He said, "Yes." She said, "You know that now." He said, "I have known it since Mrs. Fenn came to the study on Monday." She said, "That was July." He said, "Yes." She said, "You have known since July." He said, "Yes." He said, "I have been working up to saying it since July, and I have been slow about it, and I am saying it now." She said, "You have been slow." He said, "Yes." She said, "The systematic approach." She said, "Complex problems addressed in order of urgency, one at a time." He said, "Yes." He said, "I catalogued the problems in July, and I have been addressing them in order." She said, "And this is the last one." He said, "This is the most important one." She looked at him. She said, "Yes." She said it the way she said everything, directly and without apology and without decoration, just the word itself, sufficient. He said, "Yes." He said, "Yes." He said it back to her, and it was the confirmation and the answer and the beginning of the thing that had been coming since July, since the entrance hall and the winter rain eyes and the face that had not changed, and it was the right thing, and both of them knew it was the right thing, and knowing it together was the whole of the belonging. The county found out in October. The county found out the way the county found out everything, which was through the organized network of observation and inference that functioned in any county where enough people were paying close enough attention, and the network produced a conclusion that was correct before it was announced, which was that the Duke of Ashmore had formed an attachment to the herbalist's daughter from the village. The county's response was predictable. The predictable portion of it arrived in the form of Nicholas's mother, who came from her house in Bath on a Tuesday in October with the energy of a woman who had been expecting something to happen and had not expected this particular thing. Her name was Lady Renmore, and she was 64, and she had been managing the Ashmore family's social expectations for 40 years, with the same systematic efficiency with which the Ashmore estate had been managed, and she arrived at the hall on a Tuesday morning and found her son in the archive room with a young woman from the village who was cataloguing the estate ledgers. She said from the doorway, "Nicholas." He looked up. She said, "I would like a word." The word happened in the drawing room, which was the room reserved for significant conversations at Ashmore, and it lasted 2 hours, and it covered the ground that such conversations covered, which was the ground of expectation and position and the appropriate shape of a life and what it meant to be the Duke of Ashmore. Nicholas listened. He said, "At the end of it, I have been the Duke of Ashmore for 9 years, and in 9 years the hall has been maintained rather than lived in, and I have been managing a title rather than inhabiting it, and I did not know what the inhabiting looked like until a woman from the village showed me the archive of the place I have been managing and read the pattern of it and told me the estate records were the herb guide for the land." Lady Renmore said, "She is an herbalist's daughter." He said, "Yes." He said, "And she runs a practice that serves 4 households and wrote the comprehensive record of the area's medicinal plants in 2 winters and made 3 copies of it, so the knowledge would survive outside one head." He said, "She came to my kitchen on Thursday mornings for 2 years and knew the name of every person in it and brought the right thing before Mrs. Fenn knew she needed it." Lady Renmore said nothing. He said, "I told her in July she would never belong in this house." He said, "I was wrong in July, and I am correcting it now." Lady Renmore said, "The county will talk." He said, "The county always talks." He said, "The county talks about the herb guide too, probably." He said, "The talking is not the measure of the thing." Lady Renmore looked at him. She said, "You are decided." He said, "Yes." He said, "I was decided in July when I drove to the village to apologize and found a woman in a kitchen garden who spoke about knowledge surviving outside one head, and I have been decided since then." Lady Renmore said, "I would like to meet her properly." He said, "Yes." He said, "She is in the archive room." Lady Renmore said, "In the archive room." He said, "Yes." He said, "She has been cataloguing the estate records since August." He said, "She is the reason the archive is now a functional resource rather than a room full of paper." Lady Renmore said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Bring me to the archive room." He brought her. Nora was at the table with the ledgers, and she stood when they came in, and she looked at Lady Renmore with the winter rain eyes and the composure she brought to everything. Lady Renmore looked at the catalogue. She looked at the shelves. She looked at Nora. She said, "You have been doing this since August." Nora said, "Yes." Lady Renmore said, "What is the catalogue's current state?" Nora said, "The ledgers from 1780 to 1850 are fully catalogued and cross-referenced." She said, "The 1790s gap is documented, and the possible sources for filling it are identified." She said, "The post-1850 records are in better condition, but require cross-referencing with the estate correspondence, which is a separate archive." Lady Renmore said, "The estate correspondence has its own archive." Nora said, "Yes." She said, "It is in the room next to this one." She said, "Mr. Calloway showed me." Lady Renmore said, "I have been trying to get someone to address the estate correspondence archive for 6 years." Nora said, "It is in better condition than it looks." She said, "The papers are loose, but the dates are mostly visible, and the organization, is approximately chronological. Lady Renmore said, approximately. Nora said, the third Duke had a different system from the fourth, and the transition period is mixed. She said, it takes about an hour to identify the system, and then the organization makes sense. Lady Renmore said, you have been in the correspondence archive. Nora said, briefly. She said, I wanted to understand the relationship between the ledger records and the correspondence. Lady Renmore looked at her son. He looked back. Lady Renmore said, to Nora, you said, knowledge that lives in one head dies with that head. Nora said, yes. Lady Renmore said, my husband said the same thing. She said, he said it about the estate every year for 30 years. She said, he said, Catherine, this estate knows too much, and I know it all, and one day I will be dead, and the knowledge will be dead with me. She said, he died knowing everything about this estate, and leaving his son to learn it from the beginning. She said, you are putting it on paper. Nora said, yes. Lady Renmore said, the herb guide has 3 copies. Nora said, yes. Lady Renmore said, the estate catalogue will need 3 copies too, eventually. Nora said, yes. She said, the county archive is the logical location for the 3rd copy. She said, Mrs. Park at the county archive is very organized. Lady Renmore said, I know Mrs. Park. She said, Mrs. Park is the most useful person in the county. Nora said, yes. Lady Renmore looked at the archive room for another moment. Then she said, to Nicholas, I will stay for the week. He said, yes. She said, I would like to see the herb guide. He said, yes. She went out of the archive room, and he looked at Nora, and Nora looked at him, with the winter rain eyes and the almost expression. He said, she wants to see the herb guide. Nora said, I know. He said, is that all right? She said, yes. She said, it is good. She said, the herb guide exists, to be read. The week Lady Renmore stayed was a different kind of week from the weeks before it. It was the week the house stopped being maintained and started being inhabited, though it had been starting for months, and the starting was simply more visible with Lady Renmore in it, because Lady Renmore was a woman who inhabited places, and her inhabiting of Ashmore Hall for a week showed the hall what inhabiting looked like. She read the herb guide on Wednesday. She read it in the morning room, with the attention of a woman who had been waiting for someone to write this document, and was now reading it, and at the end she said, to Nora, who was in the morning room, having been invited to stay, when it became clear that the reading was going to produce questions, she said, the section on winter storage. Nora said, yes. Lady Renmore said, you distinguish between storage for medicinal use and storage for culinary use. Nora said, yes. She said, the conditions are different. She said, medicinal herbs retain their properties better in drier conditions and lower temperatures. She said, culinary herbs stored the same way lose the aromatic oils that carry the flavor. Lady Renmore said, I have been storing the kitchen herbs in the medicinal conditions. Nora said, yes. She said, most households do. She said, the distinction is not in most guides. Lady Renmore said, how did you know? Nora said, my mother had the kitchen herbs stored incorrectly, and I noticed the flavor was flat, and I asked her why, and she did not know, and I started testing storage conditions. Lady Renmore said, how old were you? Nora said, 14. Lady Renmore looked at her. She said, the systematic approach. Nora said, yes. Lady Renmore said, the problem identified, the causes tested, the solution documented. Nora said, "Yes." Lady Renmore said, "You have been doing this since you were 14. Nora said, "Yes." Lady Renmore said, "Nicholas has been doing it since July." Nora said, "Yes." Something that might have been a smile on a face less controlled than Lady Renmore's. She said, "He was slow." Nora said, "Yes." Lady Renmore said, "He is systematic, but he is slow to identify the correct category of problem." She said, "He manages estate problems efficiently and personal problems not at all." Nora said, "He identified the personal problem in July." Lady Renmore said, "Yes," she said, "and addressed it in October." She said, 3 months. Nora said, "The problems were addressed in order of urgency." Lady Renmore said, "The herb guide took priority." Nora said, "The herb guide is always the priority." Lady Renmore said, "Yes." She said, "I understand that now." She stayed for the week. She went back to Bath on Sunday with the expression of a woman who had come with one understanding of a situation and was leaving with a different and better one, and she said at the door that she would come again at Christmas, and she said it to both of them. November came. The Wednesdays continued, and the Thursdays continued, and the hall was warm in the way of a house that was being lived in, and the archive room was the most used room in the house, and the kitchen was the second most used, and the morning room, where Lady Renmore had read the herb guide, was the third. The county talked. The county talked with the thoroughness it applied to anything that deviated from expectation, and the talking was not always kind, and it reached them both through the various channels that things reached people, and they read it the way they read the estate records, for what it was, rather than what it performed. Sir Gerald Howe said, at a dinner in November, to the Duke, "The county is discussing your choices." Nicholas said, "Yes." Sir Gerald said, "They are saying she is not suitable." Nicholas said, "They are saying what they expected to say." He said, "Suitability is a question of fit, and I have been in this hall for 9 years not fitting it, and she fits it in the ways that matter." Sir Gerald said, "The ways that matter." Nicholas said, "The kitchen on Thursday mornings." He said, "The archive room on Wednesday afternoons." He said, "The knowledge that exists in 2 heads, now rather than 1." Sir Gerald said, "The herb guide." Nicholas said, "Yes." He said, "And the estate records." He said, "She is the reason the archive is a functional resource, and the reason I understand the pattern of this estate, rather than only its management." Sir Gerald said, "Callaway said the archive room had been unlocked." Nicholas said, "Yes." Sir Gerald said, "Callaway is not a man who is impressed easily." Nicholas said, "No." He said, "Callaway said she found the 1790s gap in 4 hours." Sir Gerald said, "The 1790s gap." Nicholas said, "The period of irregular management during his great-grandfather's neglect." He said, "The gap was there for 40 years, and she found it in 4 hours." Sir Gerald said, "And documented it." Nicholas said, "And identified the sources for filling it." Sir Gerald looked at his wine. He said, "The county will adjust." Nicholas said, "Yes." He said, "The county adjusts when the evidence requires it." Sir Gerald said, "The evidence is in the archive." Nicholas said, "Yes." He said, 3 copies, eventually. December came. The church in the village of Ashmore had been there for 800 years, and had seen the various ceremonies of 800 years of the village's life, births and deaths and the marriages that came between them, and it received the December ceremony with the settled patience of an 800-year-old building that had seen most of what life produced and found it manageable. The village came. Mrs. Fenn came in her best dress and stood at the front, with the authority of a woman who had something to do with this. Mr. Calloway came with his wife, who had heard the story of the archive room from her husband and had formed opinions about Nora before she met her and found the opinions were accurate. Lady Renmore came from Bath with the expression of a woman who had come for Christmas and found the Christmas was larger than expected and was entirely equal to it. Sir Gerald came because Sir Gerald came to everything worth coming to, and this was worth coming to. The county came. The county came because counties came to the Duke's occasions, and this was the Duke's occasion, and the county came with the various expressions of people who had been discussing a thing and were now present at the thing and were forming the final adjustment of opinion that direct evidence produced. Nora came down the aisle in a dress the color of the winter garden, the grey-green of herbs in December, and she came with the composure she brought to everything, and the winter rain eyes that saw the room completely and were not made uncertain by anything the room contained. He was at the end of the aisle. He was looking at her the way he had been looking at things since July, with the attention of a man who had learned that the things worth seeing did not always demand to be seen. She reached him. She looked at him. He said, very quietly, "The belonging question." She said, just as quietly, "Resolved." He said, "Yes." She said, "By winter." He said, "Yes." She said, "You specified by winter." He said, "I was optimistic." She said, "You were systematic." He said, "Yes." He said, "The most important problem, addressed last." She said, "Addressed." He said, "Yes." He said, "The correct word." She said, "Yes." The ceremony was what ceremonies were, the words and the promises and the witnesses and the 800-year-old church receiving it all, with the patience of a place that had received it many times and found it good each time. Afterward, the hall was full. The hall was full of people and warmth and the noise of a gathering that was not performing itself, but was simply present. And Mrs. Fenn had produced a dinner that was the best dinner Ashmore Hall had seen in years, which was the dinner of a cook who had been given the herbs she needed by the right person and had made exactly what was required of them. Lady Renmore stood in the entrance hall and looked at the hall full of people, and she looked at her son at the far end of the room with the woman who was now his wife, and she thought about a house that had been maintained rather than lived in for 9 years, and she thought about the herb guide and the 3 copies and the knowledge that survived outside one head. She thought about her husband saying, "This estate knows too much, and I know it all, and one day I will be dead, and the knowledge will be dead with me." She thought that the knowledge was not dead. She thought that the knowledge was in the archive room in 3 copies, eventually, and in the kitchen on Thursday mornings, and in the morning room where the herb guide had been read, and in the hall full of people on a December evening, and it was alive in the specific way that things were alive when they were being attended to by people who understood their value. She looked at the entrance hall. She thought about July and the young woman who had stood in this hall with a basket of herbs and a face that had not changed when she was told she would never belong. She had known, probably, before Nicholas knew. People who had been told they would never belong and who had not changed their faces were people who knew something about belonging that the person saying the words did not yet know, and what they knew was that belonging was not granted from outside. It was built from inside, one Thursday morning and one Wednesday afternoon at a time. The way good stock was made, from the actual thing and not the shortcut, and the person who had been building it since before she was asked to leave was the lady of the estate now, the lady of the estate from the village, the herbalist's daughter who had made the herb guide in 2 winters and made 3 copies of it and brought the right herb before it was needed, and who had read the estate records as the herb guide for the land and put the knowledge in 2 heads where it had been in 1, and who had looked at the entrance hall of Ashmore with the winter rain eyes on a Thursday morning in July, and known, even then, that the belonging was already there. It had been there all along. It just needed the right person to read it. She had read it. By winter, it was hers. Thank you for listening to this story, all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you are watching from and what the story made you feel. Do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next one.